We're lucky this year to have a fair metadata session right after what I thought was a pretty amazing plenary. I hope that you all enjoyed that. Matt Jones from NCs and myself, a new ESIP member, which is an exciting thing for me, the Metadata Game Changers, have started during, before the winter meeting, or before the summer meeting last year, to try and think about it and how we might develop a recommendation from ESIP out to the broader world of some kind of a recommendation about fair metadata. Everybody is familiar with the idea of fair data and fair repositories. There's a lot of work going on in that sort of genre of fair things that you might do to or think about to make fair repositories of fair data. Matt and I have both worked in metadata land for longer than we care to admit, and so we're thinking about metadata concepts really that might be used to support findability and accessibility and interoperability and reusability. The recommendation will be in the concept space, and we're implementing it in 3 different dialects. Ecology, markup language, ISO 19115, and related ISO standards, and then data site. So today we're going to sort of report on where we are in that work. Matt's going to show some very hopefully interesting and definitely interesting and thought-provoking results. He's going to show EML results and ISO results. I'll talk a little bit about data site, which is different, and then we'll talk about how we're trying to organize these, organize what we call checks into different categories and for the implementation of the various dialects. So we hope to have time for working. Questions are open at any point. Discussions. Matt's going to point us to a Google Doc that we have for notes, and we also have a Git repository that I think I got a link into the session description on Sketch, so you can find the link to that. I'll check when Matt starts. So Matt's going to go first. I'm going to go second, and you all are going to contribute during those 2 talks, and then go third with having a chance to give us input. Our goal is to, before the summer meeting, have something that looks like an ESIP recommendation and following in the work that many people did on the data citation principles a number of years ago. So that's sort of our goal. That's sort of what we're aiming for in the next 6 months. So Matt Jones from NCs and Data One already multiple hats.
Thanks, Ted. So as Ted said, we've been working on the FAIR suite. During the summer meeting last summer, we had a session with a lot of people in it where we tried to get people to look at what are the fundamental characteristics of metadata and data records that are really needed to make a resource fair. I don't know if for many of you that were there, you recognize it was a very large room. We had lots of good ideas and things came out of that. Over the sort of last 6 months, Ted and I and Peter Slaughter from our group at NCs have been working on basically trying to consolidate some of that input and implement a lot of that, so that now we have what we call a suite of FAIR checks, which are divided into different types for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Each one of the checks represents an atomic attribute of a metadata document, which can be evaluated for whether or not it has been met or not. Most of these are checks for things like whether or not that metadata element is present, but it can also be checks like whether or not it's adequate or sufficient. So for example, if a title is present, but it's only one word, river data, that might not be considered sufficient. And so an improvement on that simple check might be, for example, to make sure that a title has at least 7 words. If we had really smart computers, we could have them read it like it was a human and decide that in fact it was a really great title because it was very understandable. It's very difficult to go. It's very difficult to go from those simple checks, like the title is 7 words, to this is a semantically meaningful piece of metadata that everybody's going to understand and has all the right parts. Like it includes the temporal coverage, it includes the spatial coverage, it includes the types of measurements made, it includes the context in which something was done. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to automate as much of the process of building metadata quality checks as we can, which gives us a starting point for sort of additional human curation of the metadata corpus. So when we think about FAIR, the idea behind FAIR is that the set of characteristics of a record should be concise and measurable. And yet the FAIR principles themselves are pretty vague. For example, they say things like that data should be described with rich metadata. That's in the Findable section. That they're described with a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes. These don't really narrow us down as a community, telling us what really to do. So, that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to take these very high level principles, which we think are great, and really focus them on what are the specific metadata characteristics that we think are essential and useful as a community. In addition, everybody talks about, are your data fair, as if that is a binary question, right? Is true or false or yes or no? When in reality, that's not the case at all. There are degrees of fairness. That fairness is really a continuum. You can have data which are discoverable by simply having a title. Having a title and a good abstract improves your findability, right? But it's not necessarily a binary either or. So we want to emphasize that all of the work we're doing on automating evaluation is about trying to move people along a continuum and not saying yes or no, true or false to the is it fair question, because that's really the wrong path to go down. So what I'm going to present here, we've done an analysis of there's about 805,000 data sets in the Data One Federation of Data Repositories right now. And we've done a preliminary analysis of, we've done basically evaluated 45 million check tests against that corpus. And then that's for 54 discrete types of FAIR checks. And I'm going to present those preliminary results. I'm calling them preliminary because we have not yet agreed upon or decided what represents a suite of checks for FAIR. And that's really what we're trying to do within the documentation cluster, is try to come to some agreement with the community about what it means to sort of have a FAIR metadata record. And so as we've evolved, we've been releasing different versions of what we call the FAIR suite. This is FAIR suite version 0.2.2. We're trying to move towards a FAIR suite 1.00, like something that the community can say is something that we all agree this would be good. If you're moving along this continuum, this is a good set of targets to be reaching. So evaluating these 54 checks, I think, is really helpful in trying to see where we're at overall. So if you look at the entire Data One Federation, this is 45 or so repositories that represent hundreds or thousands of different sites. And like I said, just shy of 1 million data sets. Data One overall on this FAIR score suite gets about a 52. And that means is that you can think of that, roughly speaking, as that roughly 52% of the checks that we evaluated pass in the metadata corpus across Data One. But you can see that those are skewed. Each one of these plots, I'm going to show a lot of these plots. Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable are orange, red, dark green, and light blue, and respectively. And then the extent to which each wedge fills the entire pie chart tells you how much that particular score is complete. So in this case, these data sets are mostly complete on the findable category, but really reusable is still quite low. And so as I go through these, you'll get a sense of the different types of patterns that are being set up. Overall, I think this is pretty reasonable. It's not at all unexpected that we would have a lot of emphasis on discovery metadata and less emphasis on interoperability and reusable metadata. If you look across the repositories, oops. My movie won't play, but at any rate, I have a bit of a movie in here, which is not playing. I'm gonna hit escape for a second. Let's see if I can get it to play from the. Okay, so this is basically running through all of the different repositories in Data 1, and you can kind of get a sense of the variability as you move through these repositories. The scores range from about 30 to about 60, 61, and you get a sense that in general, Findable is highly, generally pretty good, but all of the other categories are highly variable. Reusable is almost always low as you move through each of these different repositories within the Data 1 network. In addition, each one of those repositories, some of those are very large collections of say 30,000 or more data sets, or like Pangea was 300,000 data sets. Others are small. There might only be 11 data sets in some of those collections. And so it's a little bit hard to compare as you move from repository to repository, but nevertheless, it gives you a sense of the sort of variability. Another way to look at the variability is to look at the monthly sort of changes in the completion of each of the check categories. So this graph shows a time series of metadata over time. So as people modify their metadata records, Data 1 keeps a track of a snapshot of those. And so we have a record from about 2004 through now. And that record basically shows that in general, although things are quite consistent, Findable is generally around 75%, and interoperable is generally around 50% or 45%, and reusable is generally around 25%. There's tremendous amounts of month-to-month variability that we're seeing. Some months within a repository, people are doing really well. In other months, that collection of data sets that they're documenting that month are very low. And so the overall average sort of obscures the fact that there's a tremendous amount of variability in what's happening day to day, and that there hasn't been a significant really change in the sort of behavior over the last 15 years. Right? We're really seeing a very similar metadata profile over time with a tremendous amount of noise. In addition, you can do things like evaluate what different dialects provide and how communities are using those dialects. So this shows the average for ecological metadata language and for the ISO 19115 family of metadata records. You can see that EML on average has about a 54, again with a highly focus on the findable, and ISO has an average of around 39 with a high focus on the findable. One of the things that came out in this, when you start looking at this, you go, well, why are ISO records generally so low on reusable? It's because what we're discovering is it's really because, in this case, a lot of the entity and attribute level metadata that you would find in an ISO record is usually buried in a data set itself. Like oftentimes they're NetCDF files that have metadata inside of NetCDF, and so people omit it from the high level ISO metadata record that's there. So although that metadata might be present in the system, it's not showing up, say, in a 19139 serialized metadata record. And that community behavior manifests in a different set of results in the checks. So it's not right or wrong, it's just a different way of doing business. This is again a sort of a snapshot of all the different repositories, and again, each one of these has its own little story about how that particular repository organizes their metadata, which dialect they use, and how they how they got to the point where they have metadata coming out. So some people might focus on, say, discoverability as their primary issue. For others, interoperability might be really important. Like you can see FEMC, the second one, and then I think down here at the bottom, LTR, the 61. They have really consistent ways of doing metadata evaluation, and so they've got relatively high scores across their whole corpus. You can also dive into any given collection with this set of tools that we've built and look at sort of in more detail how the behavior of each one of those is working. And so in this case, I'm showing a time series for 6 of those repositories. The upper left panel is the Arctic Data Center that I operate. And you can see that over time, the FAIR, the relative order of the different FAIR suites is relatively consistent, but like Findable is still really high. There's still a lot of variability, but you notice that there's a step change right around 2016. So 2016 is the year at which we at UCSB took over sort of management of this corpus of metadata, and we've been consistently working on a new curation set of practices for this repository, and you can see that reflected in the change in scores for the corpus over that time. And so repository managers can use suites of tools like this to really evaluate their corpus and try to understand how they're doing against the set of goals that they set for themselves. Once you see a set of trends, you also might want to dive into why it is that you're seeing the trends that you're seeing. And so this is a graph basically of all of the checks. So right now there's 54 individual checks. They're listed on the left. And for each of the different categories, cutting off at the top, the four rows are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, the 4 columns. So for each of the checks, this is the proportion of data sets in the collection for which that check was successful. So green is good, and orange means that it failed. So you can see that under findable, there's a lot of checks that are almost 100% green, because almost all the documents in this subsample of the collection, in fact, pass that. Whereas down in the reusable category on the bottom, many of these checks are basically missing content for the vast majority of the records in this particular collection. So a repository manager can use an output like this to really look at why it is that they're getting a particular score and where it is that they might need to work on if they want to, say, improve their reusability score. What is it that they would then need to do to modify their metadata practices in order to do that? So we've been using this within the Arctic Data Center to try to evaluate just where our curation practices need to be changed and how we can improve the system for our own use. So if you look across the checks, I'm going to sort of quickly flash up a bunch of different slides here. This is the list of checks that we're currently doing in FAIR version 0.2.2. Like I said, we've been modifying this over time. We started with 26 checks, and then we had 30 something, and now we have 54. We have a candidate list of what is it, Ted? Like 200 checks that people have identified as possible. We've only implemented 54 of those at this point. What we'd like to get to is a point where, as a community, we have some agreement about what are the both essential and desirable characteristics of a findable metadata record. And so in this case, these are the required and optional fields that we've identified for findable. There are things like the entity identifier is present, the resource creator is present, it has a set of keywords, there's a geographic coverage description and things like that. For accessible, there's fewer, there's 12 of them. They include things like that the identifiers are resolvable and that there's a contact for the distribution and things like that. For the interoperable, there's a number of things, particularly focusing on the entity and attribute metadata and whether or not people have adequately described the variables in their data sets, the units for those variables, whether they have defined their measurement types. And then in reusable, we really get into data semantics, whether or not the domain for a variable has been defined, whether or not data quality was there, whether or not adequate methods were there for really interpreting the data properly, and that sort of thing. So these are all the sort of checks that we're currently implementing. In Ted's talk, Ted's going to go into much more detail about the sort of hierarchy of these 200 checks and how we've been trying to think about a way to consistently sort of view this whole set of information and organize it in a way that we can reach a sort of a FAIR 1.0 suite. The idea that we've been trying to pursue is to get community agreement on what the set of checks are. Each sub-community that's sort of represented within ESIP and elsewhere can then choose the subset of those that are of interest to them. So they don't have to always use all of the checks that the community has defined. Like as a sub-community, you might decide that findable and accessible are the key things that you're looking for, and you focus on those and you ignore interoperable and reusable for now, and that's fine. Ted will show some examples of how, for example, in DataCite is primarily focused on findable, and that's an absolutely fine set of use cases. Like those are very important use cases that we should be pursuing, and for some dialects, that's the primary goal. For others, we're trying to reach other types of use cases, and different sub-communities can decide which subset of these checks they want to use. What we're hoping to do before the next summer meeting is to revise this set of checks and one more time and come up with a proposal that we can bring to ESIP and have sort of everybody say, yes, this is a reasonable set of both essential and desirable characteristics for metadata, and we can start evaluating those. And we'll then apply those the whole Data One network so that we can basically produce reports on every single data set that's in the Data One network. Other people can implement this and use it themselves as well. Within Data One, the way that we're applying this is we're starting a new service called Data One Plus. Data One Plus will basically provide a set of value-added services for repositories. And one of those value-added services will be a fair evaluation of their metadata collection with all the types of output that you saw that I showed in the previous graphs available to repository managers. You'll be able to get these time series analysis and deep dives into your metadata quality for a given collection, as well as other things like branded portals and customized search and things like that as part of Data One Plus. But overall, our goal is to basically base that on this idea of a community agreed sort of set of recommended and desirable fields. So we're hoping that this discussion today will really allow us to make progress on that, and that we get some of your thoughts on what those particular fields should be and what we should do with this process. So with that, I'll open it for questions, and then we'll move on to Ted. So, Kristen?
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, can I just ask you the microphone?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I mean, I immediately stumbled over what you said with the comparison of EML and ISO, because this was, EarthCam showed up as having no reusability because all that information sits inside the files. It's not in the metadata, because they are the metadata that we have to include are complex and relational. And so it doesn't work in a data site, metadata schema, and so on. So I wonder how that conflict can be solved. That, as you said, NetCDF has similar issues. You include the metadata of provenance, specifically provenance information in the data files. And,
I think the issue is really that I totally agree. There are various ways that communities organize themselves. Some people put a lot of metadata into sort of like a standard like ISO. Other people have that stuff basically inside of their data system and their databases, and we're always going to have that variability, and that's okay. The check system that I described, one of the nice things about it is that the checks are built atomically and such that you can create domain-specific or community-specific checks that might look for whether somebody's providing something in a way that's compatible with just that community. So in addition to this general FAIR suite that's looking at kind of high level, what is being exposed to the top level metadata record for a resource, you could also dive in and say, for AIDA, there are a set of 27 additional checks that go and look specifically into a database and determine whether or not some of this metadata is present or absent. So within the Data One Plus service, one of the things we're planning on doing is providing this FAIR suite, but also providing the possibility for people to create their own custom suite of checks that go beyond what's in this general thing and is useful for curation and evaluating for that particular community. That won't be as universally applicable because it's going to be, the business rules for that one repository, but it will be, I think, a way to extend it into these different ways of doing business.
And a couple things on that, Kristen. During your session, I think it was at AGU on the INR fair, I had a talk.
That was last year, a year ago.
No, there was at AGU you had one too. Remember, that was our meeting last month. Remember, yeah, but a couple things. We mentioned the documentation cluster, so trying to take responsibility for creating this. And one of the last things, similar things that the documentation cluster did was the Attribute Convention for Data Discovery, the ACDD. So ACDD started at Unidata. I took it over at NOAA for a while, and we implemented it in something called NCISO. So NCISO was a tool that was developed, and it's been embedded in Threads, the Threads data server, for 500,000 years. And what it did is it mapped those Attribute Convention for Data Discovery fields into ISO. So, and you could run that as a service using open data threads and get the representation of the metadata from the granules out into a collection or into a broader standard. I did the same thing in some work this summer with Gao Chen from Langley and the atmospheric composition people. We did the same thing with the ITART metadata standard, which is another, similar to NetCDF, it's an ASCII representation in a file. But so with these granular metadata, and that was like in that poster or the talk I gave at HU, was really about mapping from granules out into some standard. And that gives you a mapping of these, that will give us a mapping of these FAIR principles into NetCDF or into ITART or into EarthCam or into other granule metadata pieces. And the point that I was trying to make in that discussion is that F and A are really collection level things, the way we have thought about this in NASA land and NOAA land for a long time. And I&R are really granule level things. Granules are interoperable and reusable. And data sets or collections are really discoverable and accessible. So there's a transition, and you see that in some of the plots that Matt showed, the dialect analysis of transitioning into that granular level I&R part of the game.
So Chuck was next, and then.
So to build off that discussion, because IR is a harder thing, right? The thing that jumped out to me was the accessible. In fact, I'm kind of concerned on some of those repositories that the level of accessibility was much smaller than I had expected. Was that something that sort of jumped out to you guys, and do you have some thoughts about why that is? Because that should be like one of the things that is easily addressed, right? In some.
So there's a couple of different aspects of accessibility. One of which is just is the dataset landing page, for example, both present and resolvable. And in general, that's pretty good. When you actually then drill down to can you resolve and access all of the granules, you oftentimes, many of these metadata collections, the links are broken. And so accessibility is still a huge challenge. And this is one thing we've experienced with users of our data repository systems. When you go to a metadata catalog, you search for and find a record, that record has a link, you click on that link and you go to 404 land, everybody gets frustrated and upset. And yet that's still largely the case, the space we're in right now. So we really need to focus on accessibility as repository managers in a way that's,
I just have a couple of clarifying questions, and I apologize if I missed it, but the FAIR score, is it on a scale of 100?
Yeah, right now it's normalized to 100. The way it works is that we have a set of required checks and a set of optional checks. And the score is not a straight linear, so it's basically, it weights required checks more than optional checks. So the way it works is that it's basically the sum of the set of checks that have passed that are both required and optional, divided by the total number of checks that are required. So optional checks improve your score, but they never reduce it. Required checks, so if you had just only required checks, it would be a straight percentage, but the optional ones can bring it up. So basically, yeah.
Okay. And then I guess related to that, maybe I'm confused, but you showed, I think you said there are 200 automated checks. Is that different from like a metric that you're generating that aligns with these principles, or are you using the word interchangeably, or did I miss something?
So what we're calling a check is an individual atomic, say, feature or concept that we can evaluate against the metadata corpus. So it might be the title is present. That's a single check. Or the title is at least 7 words. That's a different check. All right. So right now, we've identified through this process of the last couple sessions at ESIP, this is our third ESIP session on this, we've identified about 200 of those types of checks and concepts. Of those, we've implemented 54 of those in the 0.2.2 FAIR suite. We'd like to implement much more. Many of the others, the other 150, are still not well enough defined for us to actually implement them in code. Or some of them are aspirational. They're things like, you should have a great semantically rich metadata methods description. We don't know how to write a piece of code that can tell me the answer to that question. So some of them, some of those 200 are good ideas, but we don't know how to operationalize them yet. So.
So the danger with metrics is that it can drive people to skewed behavior.
You are what you measure, yeah.
It can influence behavior, and that's a good thing.
Well, it depends on how the influence goes. And so I think we have to be really careful in like putting up those small multiples and showing those comparisons, because as we just discussed, you know, it's very contextual. And so we don't want to drive people to think, oh, I got to get my checks right. But I don't want to detract from what you're doing, because I think it's really good. But there's also some other interesting artifacts, you know, that interoperability in many cases was greater than accessibility. And that's just an artifact of the way the FAIR principles are written. You know, it's not interoperable, you can't access it. So my question is, we should make that. But my question is, have you done any sort of subjective assessment of a couple dozen data sets or so to see, you know, does this actually make sense? You know, there's meeting the checks, and then there's meeting the principles, which, and as you said, the principles are vague, but that's where you have to have that human assessment, and it's hard to get the machines to do that. Have you done any sort of subjective
Absolutely.
check against your checks?
Yeah, we're kind of in a continuous iterative loop for the last couple of years. Although we've been running this for the whole corpus at Data One, as the manager of the Arctic Data Center and the KNB, 2 repositories within Data One, we've spent a lot of our time trying to evaluate whether or not the checks are helpful for us as curators of those collections. And so we keep going back and forth and saying, well, we're scoring poorly here, but we're scoring well here. What is it that we're missing, you know, in our metadata that needs to be improved? Or what's wrong with the check? Why is the check not picking up this thing that this feature of the metadata we actually have, and it's just not showing up properly in the check? So when we get a low score, it could be due to either the metadata corpus is deficient in that concept, or the check logic is deficient. Like, it could be either one, you don't know which it is. And so we've been going back and forth in the Arctic Data Center. We'd love to have a lot more people doing that, for people that know their collections really well, doing that for their collections, looking at these FAIR results, saying like, whether, that's why I call these preliminary. Like, nobody should use any of these values for anything other than, you know, heuristically, this is useful to understand where we're at in the check evaluation process. It's not really a set of results about the metadata corpora yet.
So I just think that's a key thing in the messaging, that I think this is an excellent tool for a curator in a data center.
Yes.
It's not necessarily a great tool for comparing data centers.
No, and not only that, I mean, different data centers have different use cases and different emphases, and so they're going to have, so yeah, people, and it's really easy to get judgmental about this stuff and try to use these in a way that is trying to basically, as if it's an assessment tool. It's not. This is, when Ted and I first started this project, we called it the metadata improvement and guidance. It's not metadata evaluation and judgment, right? It's like, yeah, it is.
That funders or publishers or whatever, they want a simple check. They still think of this binary, is it fair or not?
Yep.
And so we did, it's just a messaging.
And this is all that we're showing here are the things that we can automate. There's a huge amount of metadata evaluation and improvement that's based on subjective assessment of text, right? And we're not there yet. So this is just helping to move people along. The other place we do find it useful is for individual users. We produce one of these records for each data set that's submitted. And so when the Arctic Data Center, what we do is we basically provide these reports back to end users so that they can see that their data set that they submitted is scoring where it's scoring or where improvement needs to be made before we ever get a human in the loop, which I learned is an acronym today. HITL.
I guess a follow-up question. What is the response of the person that submitted their metadata and they get back, you know, a bunch of red boxes? It seems in Maryland and Chesapeake area, there's a lot of watershed reports and water quality. Probably average is like D. When you get up to D+, you celebrate. You know, this is pretty darn discouraging. Yeah. To the people. So,
I mean, if you want to, I mean, there's absolute scales and there's relative scales, right? So I might be scoring 20% on my total suite that I've defined as important. And yet my 20% might be in the 94th percentile of records being submitted to that repository. So how you present this to users is, you know, Like, are you going to grade on a curve? Or are you going to grade absolutely? Yeah, that's all how you use the tool, not what the tool's telling you. Yep.
And having taught at university, as soon as there's an evaluation, there's a number of people are immediately comparing.
Yep.
But the real question that I was going to ask, these checks, I can understand, yes, there is a title, yes, there is a unique identifier. What happens when you are looking at something that recurs or is recurable, like keywords?
Well, let's get back to that one.
Yeah, Ted's going to kind of go dive
Oh, okay,
deeply into all the individual types of checks and concepts. So we'll have time to talk about those.
Great.
Yep. But yeah, we can.
But that question, Jeff, that kind of question, like keywords is a concept, right? And in the keyword area, we have controlled keywords and uncontrolled keywords, and the checks are different from them. If you're talking about fair, then you're in the FAIR principles, you have standard vocabularies for kinds of things. So is this metadata record using standard vocabularies, and are the things that they say are from those vocabularies, actually from those vocabularies? Because we all know that there are vocabularies that people refer to, but they never actually check to see if they're keywords. If they have a bunch of greater than signs, then it must be GCMD. So there's a lot of gradation in those checks, and when we started this, I started on this road at NOAA, and it's not like if you have 100 keywords, you get 100 points. Okay, so you be careful on your. If you have 101, then maybe you get an extra point.
All right, Ted, let's move on to yours, huh?
But those are the kinds of questions that we really want to discuss. Rahul, what do you have?
So I actually really like the idea of having a numeric score. Helps you please measure the level of data storage of an organization provides. At least internally. The question I have is regarding the acquired fields. Should that be monetary or why?
Well, let's hold that question because you're giving my talk.
Yeah,
And you probably would do better than I, but I made the slide, so I get the first shot.
This is what happens when you file the usual suspects.
Okay, so fair metadata at ESIP. This is sort of going on top of that. One of the things that, and I mean, this is one of the nice things about working with Matt on this. And we also did some work with some people from CDL when we were putting this together, is we have a lot of experience in a lot of different dialects, whether it's EML or whether it's ISO or whether it's schema.org or whether it's DataCite or Crossref or other metadata dialects, the double and core kind of stuff. We've done a lot of work in a lot of dialects, and so we're interested in what dialects can do. Just like the difference between dialects from Hawaii, they have a lot of words for surf. In the Arctic, they have a lot of words for snow. And metadata dialects are really the same way. They differ. They support different use cases, and so we're interested in characteristics of dialects. If you're a manager of a repository, you want to know what dialects should you be supporting, and that depends really on what kind of use cases you want to support. So DataCite is really a very different dialect than ISO and EML. ISO and EML are things I would call scientific documentation dialects. They're very broad. They have a lot of different stuff. DataCite is really focused primarily on findability. It's really what I'm starting to call these days identifier metadata. It's really metadata that's associated with things about identifiers and relationships between identifiers. The nice thing about it is it has 17 million records. So this thing about scores and individuals and how they respond, another thing that Matt and I are doing is really looking at sort of the statistical properties of collections of metadata rather than individual records. So that's, I think, how I tend to think about these scores anyway. So in DataCite, I did just only 100,000 records from DataCite has 1,400 different repositories in it. And this is the FAIR thing. So Matt divided his display into F, A, I, and R. In this case, these are the 15 elements that are in FAIR. or in the F part of FAIR. It's 0 to 100%. And what you see in this diagram is these guys, there's a lot of them, and these guys, there's not many of them, okay? So DataCite has 6 required fields, and they happen to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So these are the things that are, these are the mandatory fields in the DataCite schema that are required in order to get the metadata into the tool. So when we're talking about required or mandatory or optional, or the words I like now are essential and supporting, we'll get to that. What this really shows us in DataCite is it's not really the dialect characteristic, which is its focus on discovery. It's like people that are using DataCite, many of them are interested in just getting DOIs. And to get a DOI, you need a dataset record. So a lot of these things, and I need to put on my glasses, things that are here like spatial and temporal extent, they're up here in the upper left-hand corner. Spatial and temporal extent can both be described in dataset metadata. And if you're NASA or NOAA or USGS or other Earth science people, you have spatial and temporal extent for all of your data, but you're not putting it into DataCite for some reason. So it's really a process question. It's in the NOAA case, it turns out to be the transform that transforms ISO to DataCite doesn't do spatial and temporal extent. And the same is true for ESDIS. But and then, you know, I've discussed that with some of my ex-colleagues at NOAA, and they want to know, is that technical debt that they're creating? You know, if the spatial and temporal extent changes for their metadata, is that something they're going to have to try and maintain in DataCite? So that's an interesting question. Accessibility in DataCite, I tend to put the A and the I and the R together. And here the story's even more interesting or more depressing or more exciting, many more opportunities for improvement. In the field for AI and R, and this goes to the question about accessibility, is the resource URL, which happens to be the landing page. So you can't do DataCite unless you have a landing page. So basically what happens in DataCite is you really only get mandatory fields. And that's one of the rules of metadata. Actually, we demonstrated it 20 years ago with FGDC. You only get what you make mandatory. And that's true. It doesn't matter if you're NOAA or NASA or USGS or what dialect you're dealing. When you make decisions about mandatoriness versus optionality, you're basically deciding what metadata you want to get. That's just the way it is. And one of my rules is I never use the word minimum and metadata in the same sentence, except for that sentence, because this is the problem of what's the minimum metadata I need to give you, and that's what you're going to get. Okay, and DataCite demos that very nicely. Rahul.
I guess presence does not mean that you have to
Presence.
presence of required.
Good. Now he's on my next slide.
Yeah.
I love it.
But I guess my point was like these should be sort of it's a fundamentally a process which should keep on check, and that should resolve the presence of quality, right?
Yeah. Keep with that. Actually, you were on the next slide, but so I'm going to skip one and then get to that. So what I'm trying to do is to make sense of all of these checks and make them into a format that we can present them to the outside world. And first is the objects that checks are being applied to. And right now we have sort of 4 base level objects. There's a couple others, but we're trying to focus in. One is resource, one is entity, one is metadata, and one is repository. So resource is the same terminology that we used in ISO 19115, resource, and it's also used in EML. It is the thing that's being described by the metadata. So it could be a data set, it could be a granule, it could be a publication. I mean, EML has 4 or 5 different kinds of objects, but instead of making this data set, we wanted to make it more general. It could be a service. We listened to Nadine talk about OGC services. The resource could be a service. An entity this is classic FGDC jargon. Entities are entities and attributes. So they're the things in the metadata. They're the things in the data set that have properties. I usually like the definition that they're the things that you can put on maps. In a lot of spatial data sets, these could be features. So these are GML simple feature kind of things. Stations, but they have properties. So they could be rivers, they could be stations, they could be platforms, they could be different things. Metadata is the metadata itself, and then the repository is an organization that holds metadata. Now, what Rahul was just bringing up is that presence doesn't mean. Oh, the pie chart is the number of checks we have for each of those items. So I've been doing a lot of work recently on the resource piece. EML is very entity oriented, so we've got some entity things that Peter and Matt have been working on at DataSite, and then metadata and repository just have much less content. The types of checks. Now I try and stay away from the word metadata quality because I like the old school OAIS. You know, if designated community members can understand the data using the metadata, then it's good metadata. Okay, but as I mentioned earlier, we're also interested in looking at the big picture. So we basically have 1 million records from Data 1. We have 100,000 out of 17 million from DataSite. We want to look at the automated checks. I mean, there's a session which is this afternoon, sort of the Huntsville metadata, ESDIS metadata, very much curation sort of started a couple of years ago, sort of single record kind of stuff, people reading things, human in the loop, my new favorite acronym. You know, this is not that. This is automated stuff. So we have 4 kinds of checks. They're pretty much boiling down to this. One is present. Is there something in that field? And the kind of things that Rahul is asking about is once you know that things are in the field, you can start looking at the content to see, is it consistent? Is it consistent with some, you know, published vocabulary, et cetera, et cetera. But the first thing is there something there? And is that something NA or is it actually content? Resolvable URLs, there's a lot of identifiers around in URLs these days, so resolvable is also important. Sufficient is where we try and start making quantitative measures of things. Matt brought up the question of seven words in a title, and obviously I really like 8 words myself because 8 is a much rounder number. You know, so that's sort of an arbitrary thing, but it works to filter things out. And congruent is something that actually came historically from LTER and long-term ecological research and EML, because EML really has this idea of a package. Same thing as in Dryad, for instance, where you've got package metadata and then you've got the data is in the package with the metadata. So one of the things that LTER started doing is reading the metadata and then actually trying to read the data. So if the metadata said this is a table and it has 7 columns, and then you read the data and you find out that there's actually 9 columns, or if it says this column can be A, B, C, D, or E, and there's an F in the first record, you know, that kind of congruence between metadata and data. This is a very interesting thing in NetCDF land where you're looking at metadata that's extracted from, or metadata created by humans about data sets, and actually the metadata that's in the file. That was one of the things that we worked on in NC-ISO. So this is the objects that we're trying to make checks for, hang on for a second, and the kinds of checks. Question?
Quick question. You're talking about looking at data for missing elements. What happens with hierarchical metadata where you have, you know, granules, collection level, other kinds of hierarchies? How do you do the checks on something like that?
Well, as I mentioned in the discussion with Kirsten, a lot of cases at the collection level, you're really talking about F&A. Can you get at this stuff? And then once you get it, can you read it with your tools and can you understand it and trust it? So granules tend to be a little bit more in INR, and that's why we think it's harder, because the metadata is actually embedded in some file format. But we're very happy to run checks at whatever, you know, the concept that we have is definitely to be able to run checks at any level, either collection or granule. Okay, so this kind of interaction, I mean, the idea that Matt and I had, the interaction would increase as a function of time. So this is the kind of decision that sort of addresses the thing of mandatory. What do you make mandatory? What do you make optional? And also, what do you make sort of componentized? One of the things that ISO makes possible is this idea of reusable metadata components, which is really important. Things for people or online resources or processing steps or things like that you can plug in over and over again. And so coming from that background, we want to try and also do that idea, implement that kind of idea for these checks. So for people and organizations, which happen in a bunch of different places in metadata, this is my or our first sort of draft of what we think is essential and supporting. So essential and supporting are my words for mandatory and optional, because I don't really like mandatory. Actually, most scientists don't like mandatory. So this is my division. You know, for essential, present means some kind of name is there. Present is a test you'll see a lot. An email is present, and an affiliation is present. Those are the essential things that you should have, that I'm proposing we should have for every person and organization. Then the supporting things are actually the identifier for the person and the type of that identifier, or sorry, that's actually the type of a person. And that type, or the type of a party, really. So in DataCite, you can have either personal names or organizational names, and that's called individual type. So that's what that is. And then the affiliation should have an identifier. Thursday, we'll be talking about research organization identifiers, but that's what goes there.
Type is not the same thing as role.
No. Role is an interesting. Role
is not the same thing as role.
Yeah. We'll get to role. I mean, role is in here. So this is where I say to the audience, I mean, does this make sense? Does it make sense to say, okay, an email, if you have a person, you got to have an email. And all that stuff that we have from FGDC, you know, back in the ancient days, like streets and you know, that stuff, we're not worrying about it anymore. It can be there. If the dialect supports it, it can be there, but we're not going to check for it. Hang on, Mark, there's a, is that Deb? It is Deb. I think this is Deb's first ESIP.
Yeah, it is.
All right.
Thank you for reminding me of that. Figured I had to come at least once. You know, when I look at this, I think, well, except for that, you know, if we're going to make this what is essential, then we're also sort of saying we're going to balkanize the system. Because to me, the ORCID could be the essential instead, and an optional would be more the name and the email and the affiliation. Because, you know, we're finding already that the rate at which people change affiliations and change emails and the rest, if every individual data package has to keep that up, it gets out of control pretty fast.
What? Yeah, yeah.
So then when,
This is, you can tell that we've been struggling with this idea of required, optional, and essential supporting. When we operationalize that in the results that I showed, what that means again is that required fields will count against your score. Optional fields can only improve your score, which means that you're basically saying if you have a required field or an essential field, we're really going to make sure that that's present. Your score is going to be low if you're missing any of those. Whereas the optional fields or the supporting information we consider valuable, but not necessarily enough to bring your score down when they're missing. So that's the distinction that we're operationalizing. And I guess my question back to you is that useful to make that distinction? Or should we just make everything essential and just see, you know, having a title present and having having a person's name is just as important as having, say, their type or their identifier.
Do you consider conditional fields? So say I have an email or identifier.
Yeah.
We have that capability. Right now, none of our checks are really doing too much. There's a few things that do sort of comparisons among fields or do complex checks that say, you know, if this field's present, make sure these things are there, or if that field's present, do something different. but mostly we're checking single fields right now. The system can you basically take any set of this content and create any combined check that you want. So we could do any sort of more complex logic. But right now we've kept it pretty simple.
Right, I think that's my point. We need the more complex logic. Sorry.
Yeah, we've got some complex logic coming up.
Okay.
Yeah, Ted, what happens if you're dead?
Hang on. I'm getting close to that. I'll let you know. Give me your email. Give me your Jeannie, give me your orchid. I'll
To build on it, there's also quality associated with the identifier. So the nice thing about an ORCID is it's dereferencable.
Right.
And so I can go to that and find out more information, which would give you the supporting information. Right? But
Sort
it's
of.
a very simple identifier that even if it's just present on your system here, those other things may be missing, but the fact that the ORCID captures that information is important. Right? So. So I think that there's also this other dimension to the identifiers, that it's not just the fact that there's a field there with a string attached to it. If it's a URI and you can get the other information from the ORCID, then that's also valuable.
right. Tyler?
This is Tyler from NOAA. I was going to say one of the things we've been doing is using more functional email addresses. So instead of an individual being identified in a metadata record, it's like the data manager for whatever. And so if people move on to different organizations, so those are things that we would not give an ORCID to, right? So we've been taking a different approach.
That's
So
interesting.
I like the idea of doing an OR on this. So either you have a name and email and affiliation, which would take care of the functional email, like a role-based contact info, or you have an identifier, and then that would take care of it.
Yeah, that's
So I like
that point. That's
that really
good.
makes sense to me.
We need to put that into the Google Doc. One thing also, the question that we had about sort of the impact on the fragile egos that we're dealing with in this business. Right now, if you look at Crossref, which is, I think, probably the largest repository of journal article metadata in the world, there's, 18 million items in it, I think, or is it 180 million? Yeah, 180 million. Only 4% of those have ORCIDs. Okay, so if we want to have a test that 96% of the records are going to fail, that's okay with me because I'm used to failure. But that's another thing. I mean, so, and Matt said, Matt used the word aspirational. So I think making identifiers, putting them in the supporting box here, really, I hated doing it because of, the same point. But we also have to think about what exists. And the problem in the journal business is that even the publishers, which are super important in this business, are only getting ORCIDs for corresponding authors. So that's only, that's sort of like an average, even the best, to say something like 14, maybe 20% getting ORCIDs. So and now we're talking about roars on Thursday, there's only affiliation information in Crossref for roughly, between 10 and 15% of the records. So affiliation and identifier, even an affiliation string that says metadata game changers, is really rare in big collections of metadata these days. So we have to be careful about that.
This is a good example to bring up, because it's bringing up a lot of questions.
Yeah.
I think one thing we're overlooking is that stamped on every metadata record is a currentness reference. So it can say this was generated on this date.
Right.
I don't know if these
We're coming
fields
to that.
are necessarily updated as part of the currentness. So maybe that's a quality check that's a little more complicated, because the contact information that's in the metadata matched what's on record in some official authoritative repository.
That's a sort of that would be a congruence type of check, I think.
It's 12. It's a little after 12.
Yeah, we're not going to make it through all these slides. We're just going to have to live with that. Okay. Let me get back. Okay, so this is identifiers, same kind of a picture. For identifiers, I think I'm proposing essential is either the identifier is there, it's present, and it's resolvable. So then the supporting information is the type, could be DOI, could be ROR, could be ISNI, could be whatever. And then the schema URI. So both of those I'm putting in the supporting category. Do you like that? Oh man, identifier is easy. Should have started with that. So now the other thing that we need to sort of decide about each of these checks is where do they fit in terms of the use cases? So do they support F, A, I, or R? I call those use cases. So this is sort of what I'm thinking. Findable is the resource contact, the resource creator, the resource publisher, and the resource award funder. So those are things that you might use to search for data. When you want to get the data, you need to talk to the distributor. And when you want to reuse it, you want to find out who controls the license. Well, yeah, the license comes under a different piece. These are the people, these are the roles. So this is your question earlier, Mark, about where roles are right now. These are what I call roles by location. So they're the names of the fields. But this is another thing that we want to get in this community to figure out who goes where. And then if you look at DataSite or ISO, and EML is pretty similar to the ISO case in this. These are the other kinds of contributors and people that are in these two metadata dialects, in addition to the ones we just did. These are just controlled shared vocabularies. Are there things in this list that people in this group think we should be testing for, in addition to the 6 things, the creator, the things that I mentioned earlier. And yeah, that's one of the things we need to figure out in terms of the recommendation. So this is the role question that Mark asked.
So bear in mind, ramp happy and fair always emphasizes that fair is for machines, not people. So just to throw that out there, maybe we don't need people.
Well, these are people that are in the metadata.
Right, but I mean, to be findable, accessible, et cetera. I'm just sort of a speculative question. But ideally, there doesn't have to be a human-to-human contact, but of course there is. But my understanding of the FAIR principles is that if you have to call someone, then it's not accessible.
Well, in this case, in this case, you may need to call them to.
Humans still have to be involved.
I think we've moved beyond that. The perception or the understanding of FAIR has gone beyond just machine readable. And as somebody said earlier, the funding agencies look, oh, is it fair? They're interested in reusability, not through machines, but by the humans in their daily research. So I think the community has kind of redefined the FAIR.
Yeah. Well, it's gotten all the way to metadata, so next is meaninglessness, but yeah, I think that this is another thing that in this case, when I was trying to move these little boxes around, the things in Findable are things that you might search for. So I might search for data sets that Mark Parsons was a creator for. And then once I get those data sets, I can access them somehow. And then I'm trying to use them and understand them. So there I might need to send Mark. I wouldn't be able to call him because phone number is not in the thing. But you might need to talk to the people who created it or other people that have reused it to try and understand it. Did you have a question? Back row, Kai?
So I'm kind of new to this and just trying to absorb all of this. This is a system that you seem to be creating to have a machine evaluate whether the data that you're producing are fair.
Right.
And I can see that this system, once people start getting used to this would be pretty easy to gain, because there's a bunch of fields and you can put stuff in the fields, and the stuff that you put in there may not really be useful or even true or correct. I just wondered if you had thought about having something similar to a peer review system, where you would have a data set that would actually be evaluated by a human being, who would check to make sure that some of this stuff really is true.
Yeah.
And actually use that peer evaluation to raise this fair score that you're talking about.
Right. At 2 o'clock this afternoon, there's a session, and one of the organizers of it is 2 rows in front of you about some evaluation, metadata evaluation work, which started out much more, it wasn't actually peer review, it was curation, I would say, metadata curators looking at each record. And so my point of view on that is that both of these things, human in the loop looking at it and machines looking at it are both helpful. We want to look at 800,000 records. And so we could have had this session, we could have given each of you 50,000 records to evaluate during this hour and a half, and we would have gotten close. But you really need both of these things happening at the single record level, at the collection level, at the dialect level. You need to understand, you need everything together here.
Yeah, I've been doing the machine actionable stuff as a precursor to human curation. That it helps speed up the process and finds the things that are easily detectable as problems. So I would say these are necessary but not sufficient checks. When we talked about the different types of checks, there was present, resolvable, sufficient, and congruent. That sufficient and congruent, those types of checks are starting to get more into the semantics of the metadata, and whether not only is it present, but are there aspects of that metadata field that meet the sufficiency criteria for that kind of content. And so an abstract that is 2 words, I can guarantee is not sufficient as an abstract, right? But can I write and can I operationalize a machine actionable check that determines whether an abstract is sufficiently semantically rich? I don't think we can do that yet. So a human will have to come along and review that afterwards, but at least we can reject all the abstracts that are definitely not sufficient. To focus our human curation time on the things that that really matter.
What was I going to say? Oh yeah, okay.
I just wanted to follow on with the accuracy information. There was, AGU had this huge push for this fair, which has sort of changed the original sort of idea of it. And I think that accuracy is sort of losing out. And if data repositories are just trying to be fair, sort of this underlying value of accuracy, which is probably the most important thing of data repositories, people might start to lose focus on that. And it would be nice if we added accuracy to it, or if there was, sort of the higher level people that want to make data repositories fair. If you lose out accuracy, you lost everything. So keeping that in mind is, a hard thing to do if you start focusing on those 4 things as scores or whatever.
But keep in mind, the 4 things are just categories. The real checks are based on these concepts. So if you feel that there's metadata concepts that should be evaluated that are not in our lists, we'd love to have those suggestions. Like if there are accuracy fields or concepts within the metadata that should be checked for all the records, then we should let's identify those as a candidate. I think we have some of those already in there, but that's where we need many eyes to look at these and help us find out what are the essential things, what are the supporting things that need to be checked for each of the records.
Yeah, and while the microphone's going to the back, another thing, we need to think about these records. Oh, there was a hand in the back too, but we'll go ahead.
So maybe before that, so just a very quick question. So saying that we can add or reduce some of your checklists. So how can I access those, and also your mappings between your checkpoints to particular attributes within the metadata?
You want, yeah, why don't you? We'll go back.
everything's in, all of the checks and lists are in a GitHub repository, and at the end of Ted's slides, there's a link to both the repository and the notes document. But basically, it's all open source, and we have a wiki page that lists all the checks. We have a spreadsheet that shows them all, and then we have all the code that operationalizes those checks. And we really love input and additions to all of that. We were hoping during this session to get kind of into that, but it looks like we're going to just get into high level stuff here.
So Matt just said that there's links in the end of Ted's slides, which we're never going to let him get to.
Yeah, now let me see that.
And then everybody should probably look at those.
Yeah, these slides, these slides aren't actually yet. They will be, both in Figshare and also in the sketch.
So I think one thing that's really hard for me about FAIR is this fact that there's been this huge push on FAIR. Every program manager, every group keeps saying, but are you fair, right? And the problem is when we talk about all these intricate checks, and then we say, oh, these are just going to be for internal to the repository. It's already been mentioned before, but that's not going to be the way that this is going to work if we continue down this path. I like the path. So what I'd like to propose is that we talk about two sets of things that we're trying to do. One that is define a set of complex checks that can be utilized by a repository to continually be working on improving its own, the data sets internally and on evaluating them, where they can put in all sorts of specialized logic for their types of data and things like that to really enable. And then a much more minimalist set of checks that are continually increasing over time that are sort of a public level checks. Where like the first ones might just be basic findability, accessibility, citability, licensability, right? That they're just simple things like, can someone find this data set, get to it, and use it, period, right? If we find a way to have a set of evolving checks that are the sort of public version of evaluating these things, and then the internal ones, I think we're all going to be a lot happier because we're going to fight too hard over all these internal ones otherwise, because our fear is all going to be that's going to become public, the public version of things. And we're all going to be afraid to have them ever exist for that reason.
It's great. I'm not so worried about getting through these slides, although they're beautiful and incredibly well prepared. But this discussion is exactly exactly what we hope to have in this, and having levels of this. Matt uses the word suite, and we haven't. We've defined it before, but the idea that we had is that we have a lot of checks, and then certain groups could pick the ones. A suite is a selection of checks from a big menu of the ones that you think are important for your repository or your community, and they're also designed to be extensible. So I think having some that are like, I would call the simple ones maybe the essential ones that we can agree on, and maybe the supporting ones are more are the more complex ones. But all of this is the nice thing about ESIP is it gives us a community that we can use and discuss this, and we'll come out with a paper that'll get 200 or 300,000 citations. So that's our goal. But a couple other things I wanted to say. First of all, I really try and stay away from the phrase metadata quality, because the tests that I've done in pretty much all of the cases are really testing completeness and consistency. So those are the things that I do tests for, because as I said, I started out by saying to do metadata quality, you need users that can actually prove that they can understand your data from your metadata. And the congruent stuff and the sufficiency stuff that came out of the history of LTER checks is sort of a step closer to quality. And then the curation and actually having humans read stuff or machines read stuff, that's sort of getting closer to quality. But so if you hear me say metadata quality, please excuse me. Because what I really mean in most of my stuff is the presence. And I agree that people can game this. Someone was talking about gaming. So when we did this at NOAA, we subtracted 5 points from the score for every time NA occurred in one of those fields. Okay, so that's sort of the consistency check. Once you know that these fields exist, you can look at them across the collection and see which ones are good and which ones are opportunities for improvement. And that's the important part of this evaluation stuff. Someone said the word reject, but what's really important about the evaluation piece is the acceptance. It's being able to find good examples. We know from the history of talking about metadata for eons that the problem is I'm sitting at my thing and like, what do I put in this field? So sometimes the most complete metadata is good examples and finding good examples. And that's really another important, really, I think the most important thing about evaluation is not finding the opportunities for improvement, but finding the good examples that the people that want to improve their metadata can use to look at and figure out. And in some cases, there's sort of automated ways they can fill things in, and in others they need to think about it and talk about to users. So let's really think about finding good examples. And if unfortunately, if you want to find a good metadata example, sometimes you need to look at 800,000 records. They didn't get that one. Okay. So now the kinds of things that we're doing with identifiers are the things that have identifiers, awards and entities and controlled keywords, resources and metadata. And here, in my argument, pretty much all identifiers are supporting, although resource and metadata should be, I think, essential, identifiers for resources and for metadata. I'm just going to sort of give you some idea of the things that we're thinking about, kinds of people and organizations that have identifiers. We talked about this a little bit before. One of the important things about metadata, and this is one of the things that DataCite focuses a lot on, is connecting resources, building those knowledge graphs that we talked about yesterday, and we saw some examples of this morning, connecting between things that metadata for things or descriptions or is reviewed by or is cited by or is referenced by or is used by, and that adds to things like provenance that we'll get to in a minute. So the objects for resources, which is where I've been sort of focusing most, this is the proposal right now, and this, completely open to discussion of the resource things that are under findability. We talked about the people that are under findability before. Now we're talking about the other things: titles, abstracts, keywords, publication dates. There was an update question about when was the metadata updated. That's right here called data, the revision date. And then different kinds of extents, spatial and temporal extents, and then taxonomic extents that exist in EML primarily. And geographic description is an identifier for a location rather than a latitude and longitude. So it's a textual representation of a feature. In AINR, distribution, landing pages, usage rights, file size still exists in a lot of disciplines or a lot of dialects. Once you get the data, you need to know the format. You might need to know the services that are supported for the data set in the repository. And then things related more typically to reusability, methods, or provenance, a citation for the data, checksums to make sure you got the right data, and contents, and then related fields like we talked about before. For awards are important, having information about awards. In this case, some description of the award is what present would be, an identifier for the award, and then who was the funder for the award, along with an identifier for that affiliation or for that organization, and also the presence of that affiliation.
What function does that serve?
What function does the funder?
No, this F-A-I or R, is it a findable?
I think it's under supporting F, I would say, because you might want to search for all of the data sets that came from a certain NSF grant number or something like that. So I tend to put things in F if I think people might search for them. And of course, when we know that there's a set of users called program managers in NSF or in NASA or in NOAA or other places that want to find work that is related, data sets or papers or things that are related to their funding. So in that case, researchers might not use that, although they might, but that other that other community would definitely use it. 5 minutes, okay. Things about metadata. Metadata has, I think it's essential to have an identifier, and that identifier should be resolvable, and then supporting things about metadata, creation dates and revision dates, license for metadata. I'm not really sure when that's going to be useful, but it might be in cases where I'd be happy for someone to suggest a case where that could be useful. And then also the schema that's being used for the metadata and whether the metadata is valid with respect to that schema. Repositories only have a couple things we've thought of so far. Some way of counting citations to objects that are in the repository. Matt and others have been working on the project Make Data Count and using the counter standard for usage. We saw some interesting stuff this morning about quantifying usage. And then citation, links to here's how you cite these data. And provenance. Provenance is a big section of provenance here at the beginning, which are identifiers of related resources. I mentioned that earlier. That's important in provenance, so you know the relationships between things. And then at the bottom, actual code for process steps or the source entity that things came from, and then the provenance trace. We finally got to the end of the slide that has the link to the Google Doc, which has some other links and opportunities for you to write things in. So Deb, we made it to my last slide. Oh, and of course Zoe's there because she always has questions. Dave.
Just before you start. Oh. So this document that is linked here just has some sections for general notes. If there are things that didn't come up in the discussion, please feel free to add them. If there are specific things you think should be added or changed in the suite of checks, we'd love to hear feedback. And so just adding stuff to the document, even though we didn't get enough time in the session to put it in there, would be really useful. Even after
Okay, so this is getting back to the findability, to be fair. So there's two different types of findability that I kind of see. One is a still typed kind of findability where it's extremely findable within the repository itself, and then there's more distributed findability where there's third-party search engines that have, JSON LD tags, for example, that they use for automated crawling and so forth to develop high index search rankings and so forth. So, for example, at Kodak, we've incorporated JSON LD tags following the schema.org convention for all of our persistent JSON pending pages. Where does that? I stepped in 15 minutes late, so maybe I missed it. But where does schema.org fit in the F for the consistency and completeness checks that are going on?
Well, so schema.org is a dialect in our jargon, and we haven't looked at schema.org. So one of the interesting things would be to take these concepts and map them to schema.org so that we can test schema.org. We do have a check, which is the one with the longest name. Oh no, that's not the longest name, but there is a check for whether the landing page has schema.org metadata in it. So that would be a check that's if someone thought that schema.org was important for their community or for their repository, they could use that check against the data sets in the repository as a check that they might select. And they can make it mandatory or essential or supporting.
Yeah, and related to that, the only comment I would have is that when you find things that are missing from schema.org, please go, if you think it's worthwhile, please go and suggest that they be added, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
That's another community, which is an open community, which, and I know you're part of some of the geoschemas
open
groups here in ESA. So I think that that's an important thing also.
Yeah, and of course, the schema.org cluster is a place in ESIP where a lot of that's being discussed.
And I just wanted to point out that schema.org is like DataSite in the sense that people have it for a particular reason, which in this case to get themselves into Google Data search, whereas DataSite is to get themselves on a DOI. And so they tend to be very minimal about what's in that record. So like Ted said, schema.org is another dialect. And so in addition to checking whether a landing page has a schema.org entry, we could also be checking that schema.org entry to see if it's congruent with their ISO metadata record. So there's lots of ways in which these different components of the metadata landscape interact, and we need to work on all of this.
I don't have any more slides, Rahul, so you're gonna...
For those of us who've been working with data and metadata for a while, FAIR was nothing new, right? I mean, it's a nice little acronym added on. There was one aspect of FAIR that I thought was very intriguing, which was the richness of metadata. That how do you provide context for your data so that the data can be reused? And that's something we as data providers don't think about. We have to go and write metadata for the community meeting it's going to serve. And it has been shown that a lot of the data set gets reused by a completely different community. So I think it might be useful, I think what you guys are doing, to think about that richness part and how do we figure out how we quantify or measure it. That'd be very useful.
Well, we would love to have your input on that as well.
But yeah.
It's a little bit more than power.
It's more, but I think that's where the complexity really comes in. You know, again, coming from the long tail and the diversity of stuff that we have, that, you know, it's very difficult to just stand here and create a common evaluation of what is good and what is not good. And I mean, I'm really concerned, and especially about, you know, the aspect of providing even the results of checks of data sets to the providers. You know, we ask people who submit to us to help us complete metadata, and as I said, they don't sit in, you know, an external metadata catalog, but in the files. If they see, oh, your data set is not reusable, and they have worked for weeks with us to get the metadata right, I'm, you know, really, really concerned in getting these things out before they really checked across the community, and we can make a judgment that, you know, this reflects really the fairness of data. I really want to caution, you know, on moving forward. Maybe
right.
we need a more, you know, focused discussion, longer discussion about this. I'm giving you feedback. Is that the first step?
Yeah.
Okay.
But remember that we don't say, you know, I mean, this is your score. And as Matt said, the name of the project that we started this other was improvement and guidance. So it's really more, the sentence that I would think about is that here are 5 other metadata records that were created by people like you that have this information in them that is supporting some use case for their users. And here's how you might add that information into your metadata. So I would see this, and we did this with ACDD in NOAA. You know, people would give us things that would get 4 out of 40, and the interaction with them while they were creating these netCDF files got those scores up to 40. So.
We have done that interaction already. It's there, right?
Okay.
It just doesn't sit in places where it's machine.
Any other questions, final comments? Leslie from
I just
Australia.
have to comment that we have been scoring people in our repository for a couple of years, you know, as it comes in. And usually, yeah, they get a 4 out of 40 and they're a bit disheartened, but we found that they gradually improved over time because they go back and then fix their internal system so that next time around they get a better score.
Right.
So, yeah, the scoring thing sounds horrific to start with, but it does work.
Yeah, well, in this community, how many people went to school for a really long time? And they got graded all that time. When we started doing this at NOAA, there were people that were completely driven by getting good scores, and that's okay with me. You know, if people are going to game this system by creating more complete and consistent metadata, I'm all for it. So anyway, thanks so much. Matt and I are here all week. There is going to be this session I mentioned after lunch. But thanks so much for the discussion and the input, and we'll keep moving forward. Oh, we didn't see if we had anything online.
So what are you planning to do about that? I mean, I feel like either I change the whole repository, put the metadata into
Good examples of which metadata which you think has context, like human curated ones, the data one.
Yeah, I mean, I would talk to Matt. You know, what I would do in that case is start by looking at those at his sort of which repositories have the most complete metadata, and then start looking at that for good examples, and then find out if they give you the context, or find the set of checks that we have that we think support that kind of context question.
I have a team that's looking at machine learning approaches on things, and I have a poster to justice to what we're doing. But I'd be interested to explore whether we can actually figure out if the description and title has enough context if we compare it against a single corpus.
Yeah.
That's what we have to do.
Well, you know, the talk in Paco's talk was really.
But this is they're looking at network, we are looking at the text itself. Like how do you look at the text that's given in the description and then compare against what's in the corpus?
Yeah, do you know about the deep dive project? I mean, that was another one. Yeah, and so, I mean, I think there's a lot of people, and there's a bunch of people that are trying to do text, NLP to get methods and even data sets that people are using, trying to find descriptions in the text of the articles. And yeah, I think that's all those things are good. I would love it if all of the tests that we're doing, we're getting scores of like 90%, and then we could start going. Yeah, it's all yours. But right now we're trying to get everybody above 10%, right?